Okay, let's unpack this. What if a huge chunk of history, especially the medieval period, isn't what we think? What if it's, well, a kind of illusion, chronologically speaking? Today we're doing a deep dive into a really audacious theory that challenges centuries of accepted historical facts. It's called the New Chronology. Our mission is to explore excerpts from The Issue with Tsar's Helmet, which is book 13 in the History, Fiction, or Science series by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb, two Russian mathematicians. We'll look at their, let's say, radical claims, the evidence they put forward, and naturally the huge controversy around it all.
Absolutely. We'll be examining how they argue that, the history of massive empires, how language and numbers even developed, and the dating of famous artworks, that it's all been fundamentally misinterpreted or maybe even deliberately changed. What's really striking, I think, is just the sheer scale of their challenge. It's not minor tweaks. It's a total rewrite.
Right. So let's get into the core claim. The New Chronology basically says our standard historical timeline, the one shaped mostly by scholars like Joseph Justus Scaliger and Dionysius Batavius back in the day.
Yeah.
The ones who really set up the framework we use is just fundamentally flawed.
Exactly. They argue that events we date before the 11th century are mostly just phantom reflections, as they call them, echoes maybe of real events from the later Middle Ages, but repeated in the records due to mistakes or maybe even intentional misdating.
So if that's the case, what does it mean for how we date things generally?
Well, connecting that to the bigger picture, their theory argues that all the standard dating methods, archaeology, dendrochronology, tree rings, paleography, studying old handwriting, numismatics, coins, even carbon dating, they claim these are either just wrong or they inherently depend on that traditional flawed chronology anyway. So it kind of pulls the rug out from under everything, which naturally raises a huge question. How on earth do they reach such a sweeping conclusion?
Okay, and here's where it gets really wild. A central pillar of their theory is this claim of a massive Slav-Turk Empire. They call it the Russian Horde. They say this empire dominated Eurasia right up until the 17th century.
And they don't just mean the Mongols we usually think of. They lump together ancient Scythians, Huns, later Mongols, Pechenegs, Cossacks, even modern Ukrainians and Belarusians. They argued these were all just parts of this one single huge entity.
Which leads them to say that these nations asserting their independence now are basically suffering from a historical delusion. A pretty provocative statement.
Extremely provocative. It redefines centuries of national identities.
Okay, so let's look at some of the specific evidence they use. They start with something pretty concrete. Arabic inscriptions on weapons that are definitely identified as Russian. Now, mainstream history usually looks at that and says, okay, these must be imports from the Middle East, from Islamic lands. The assumption is Russian craftsmen wouldn't know Arabic, partly because of this supposed long-standing hostility between Orthodox Russia and the Muslim world.
Right. But Fomenko and Nosovskiy flip that completely. Their counter-argument is that Russia, Turkey, Persia, these were all part of the same great Mongolian empire until the late 16th century. If that's true, then shared cultural traditions, like how you forge and decorate weapons, would have been completely normal. It wouldn't be foreign.
Okay, take the Jericho Hat. It's a ceremonial helmet worn by Muscovite czars, made of Damascus steel, decorated in 1621 by a Russian craftsman, Nikita Davidov. It's got Orthodox symbols like the Archangel Michael right there next to Arabic inscriptions. One is a Quranic phrase, make the believers rejoice. And get this, they emphasize there were no Slavic inscriptions on it at all.
Which really makes you pause, doesn't it? Why mix these symbols so freely if the cultures were supposedly locked in hostile opposition? The authors point out that many modern historical accounts tend to, downplay these inscriptions. They make them all but invisible or don't mention them or just say they were decorative patterns. They see this as a kind of reluctance to admit that Russians might have been quite familiar with Arabic script.
And it's not just the helmet. They point to a knife belonging to Prince Andrei Staritsky, early 16th century. Signed in Russian, yes, but it also has an Arabic inscription.
Right. And the authors claim that when historians label such inscriptions illegible, it's often just a convenient way to sidestep evidence that doesn't fit the standard story.
They give more examples, too, like Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich's armor from 1670. The helmet is decorated with actual Quran verses, including the Shahada. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet.
And again, their argument isn't that these were foreign luxury goods. They insist these were overwhelmingly Russian-made weapons, manufactured in known Russian centers like Moscow, Tula, the Urals. They even float the idea that Damascus steel, maybe the term Damascus actually referred to T Moscow, like Moscow with a T article prefix.
Wow, okay. And it wasn't just Arabic script either. They mention a fancy saber from 1618 made by Ilya Prosvit, another Russian craftsman. This one had Latin characters on it. And, maybe even more telling, they found an Arabic version of Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov's title on a saber he received as a gift. And that title explicitly uses the word Khan.
So they directly challenge the whole mass import idea. They ask, where are the giant weapon factories in medieval Arabia needed to produce all this? Meanwhile, Russia did have well-known centers like Tula and Zlatoust, famous for heavy armaments back in the 14th to 16th centuries.
Which leads them to this bigger speculation.
Could the famous Arabic conquest that swept across the Middle East and North Africa actually be a distorted memory, a historical reflection of the Mongolian or Great Conquest? The one that pulled huge territories into this supposed Russian empire, the Horde? They even suggest a linguistic link. Maybe Arab comes from Horde or Orda?
That's quite a leap.
It is, very speculative based on phonetic similarity.
They also talk about museum collections, like in Alexandrovskaya Sloboda and Kolomenskoye. They found lots of Russian armor chainmail, helmets, shields covered in Arabic script, often right alongside clearly Russian artistic styles, even depictions of animals and people, like an Amazon figure on one helmet.
Which, as they point out, would clash with the later, stricter Islamic prohibitions against such imagery. For them, it paints a picture of a very different, much more blended cultural landscape in that earlier period.
And these claims go beyond just weapons, right?
Oh, yes. They bring up the 1626 Miter that's a ceremonial bishop's hat belonging to the Princes Mstislavsky. It's in the Troitz-Sergiev monastery. On the very front, right over the golden cross, there's a big red gemstone with a carved Arabic inscription.
Prominently placed, not hidden away.
Exactly. Their argument is its placement shows it had real intended meaning. It wasn't just decoration.
So what's the implication of that?
While connecting this to the broader theory, the authors suggest it points to a much closer relationship, maybe even a kind of unity, between Orthodox Christianity and Islam between the 14th and 16th centuries. A historical reality, they claim, that the later Romanov dynasty actively worked to cover up.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. They cite a text called The Voyage Beyond the Three Seas. It's by Afanasi Nikitin, an Orthodox Russian merchant or traveler from the 15th century. His diary reportedly just flips between Russian, Turkic, and Arabic without any issue. He even supposedly uses Allah instead of God when writing Orthodox prayers for Russia.
Yeah, that's pretty startling, if accurate. He apparently writes about Russia using the name Urus in Turkic and Arabic script. And he noted connections between faiths, like saying the Indian Buddha cult recognized Adam from the Abrahamic traditions.
So the question Fomenko and Nosovskiy raise is, why would an Orthodox Christian writer back then use these languages so interchangeably, especially in prayers? Why blend these concepts?
And again, they point out that mainstream historians tend to brush this off. They say the text must have been misinterpreted or maybe distorted by later scribes or editors, even though the surviving texts were preserved in monasteries. Fomenko and Nosovskiy see this dismissal as, well, suspicious. Convenient, maybe.
Then there's this discovery from 1942. The body of a 17th century monk, Simeon Ulianov, was exhumed from a sarcophagus in Uglitch. His monastic clothing was remarkably well preserved.
And because it was handled initially by medics, not historians focused on preservation, some details were noted that might otherwise have been missed. The clothing apparently had lettering in Cyrillic, yes, but also Arabic, and even a third mystery script. And phrases like Allah, Allah, which looks a lot like Allah, Allah, were found, possibly used where you'd expect the Slavic word for God.
Wow. And what happened to the other things found with him? Scrolls, documents?
Well, here's the thing. According to the authors, scrolls and ordination documents were found with the remains, but they allegedly disappeared. Despite inquiries to museums and archives, they couldn't be located. Their contents, any interpretations, remain unknown.
So the authors suggest.
They suggest these missing documents might have contained more of these illegible parts, or used scripts that are deliberately suppressed because they just don't fit the neat historical picture we have.
And one more example on language.
Yeah.
The travel diaries of Archdeacon Paul of Aleppo from the 17th century. He was Orthodox, documenting his father, the Patriarch of Antiochia's, visit to Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich in Moscow.
It's an official record of a major diplomatic and religious visit.
And it was written in Arabic.
Yes. And even conversations with the Russian Tsar himself were apparently transcribed using the Arabic alphabet.
How do mainstream historians explain that?
The usual explanation is that the Patriarch and his son were ethnically Arab Syrians, so it was natural for them. But Fomenko and Nosovskiy argue that's not enough justification for an official ecclesiastical document of this importance. For them, it hints at a much wider use and acceptance, maybe even fluidity, of Arabic within Russian society and its official functions at the time, something we don't usually acknowledge.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit, because their challenge isn't just to political history or language, it's also to mathematics, specifically the history of our numbers.
Right. This is another huge part of their theory. They fundamentally contest the origins and the timeline of our modern numerical system. They argue that positional decimal notation, where the position of a digit determines its value, like in 123 plus decimal fractions and even logarithms, they claim these were all invented and only really spread much later than we think, probably late 16th to early 17th century.
Which has massive implications, doesn't it?
Huge. It means any text we think is ancient Babylonian, Indian, Arabic that seems to use positional notation, according to them, it cannot predate the 16th century.
So like ancient Sumerian math.
They'd argue those achievements, often dated thousands of years BC, actually belong to the 16th to 18th centuries AD, and those clay tablets, maybe just a symptom of paper shortages during that later period, not a sign of extreme antiquity.
Okay, that's bold. But where do they think our numbers did come from then, if not India via the Arabs?
Here's where it gets really specific. They propose that Arabic numerals actually derive from a Greco-Slavic system, specifically from Russian shorthand script used in the 16th century. They show visual comparisons, trying to demonstrate how digits like 1, 2, 4, 8, and 9 could evolve from Slavic letters that were used to represent numbers.
Interesting. Are there any specific examples that stand out?
Well, what's really fascinating and frankly quite strange is their claim about swapped numerals. They argue that the symbols for 3 and 7 and the symbols for 5 and 6 were deliberately switched at some point.
Switched how?
Okay, so look at the modern number 3. They say it's identical to the Slavic letter Z, or A, which originally stood for the number 7, and the modern number 6. They say it's a mirror image of the Slavic letter Ye, or E, which originally represented the number 5.
Wait, so why? Why would anyone deliberately swap numbers around?
Their explanation ties back to the empire idea. They contend this reshuffling happened in the 17th century during the supposed decline and fragmentation of that great Russian Horde empire. It was part of a deliberate effort, they claim, to obscure the Greco-Slavic roots of the numerals, to create a new history, and basically sever the cultural and linguistic and even numerical ties to the old empire.
Okay, so if numbers were swapped, and maybe the shapes were still evolving, how does that affect historical dating?
This leads directly to their concept of centenarian shifts. It's a key mechanism for how history got messed up, in their view. Imagine a document dated, say, 1614, written using this older notation. If the symbol for 6 back then actually represented the value 5, but later someone reading it misinterpreted that symbol as the modern 5, which also has the value of 5. Wait, let me rephrase that example based on their 56 swap. Okay, let's try this. Suppose a date was written like 1E14, where E was the old symbol for 5, so the day is 1514. If later that E symbol somehow got confused with or changed to look like the modern mirrored 6-5, someone might read it as 1614. Or vice versa. Let's use their 37 example. If a date used the symbol E, which they say meant 7, to write, say, 1317, but later became our modern 3, maybe it gets misread as 1313. No, that doesn't add a century. Let me reread their example logic. Oh, okay. They focus on how the interpretation changes. If a date was written, say, using a symbol representing the value 6, but that symbol looked like the later symbol for 5, then a date like 1614 might be misread later as 1514 if that 6 symbol was mistaken for a 5 symbol. This adds 100 years instantly.
I see. So a visual misreading based on evolving or swapped number shapes could artificially age documents by a century or more.
Precisely. And they claim this wasn't just accidental. They think Scala-Ligurian historians used this ambiguity extensively to deliberately push 17th century documents back into the 16th, 15th, or even earlier centuries, creating artificial antiquity.
And they apply this to our history, too. You mentioned Dürer and Cranach.
Yes. Albrecht Dürer, usually dated 1471, 1528. Lucas Cranach, 1472, 1553. The new chronology argues Dürer actually lived much later, late 16th to early 17th century. They point to his famous melancholy engraving from 1514. There's a magic square in it. They claim one of the numbers, a figure 5, looks like it might have been corrected from a figure 6, suggesting the original numerical values were different.
Though inconsistencies in how the numbers are drawn.
Exactly. They show examples from Dürer's self-portrait, his Battle of the Sea Gods, other works, where a figure usually read as 4-month in a date like 1493 looks remarkably similar to that Slavic letter E, which they say stood for 5. This would imply the date should actually be read as 1593, not 1493.
And similar things with Cranach.
Yes, they show examples where Cranach's figure for 5 sometimes appears mirrored or varies in form. For them, this isn't just artistic license. It reflects a period, the 17th century, they argue, when the shapes of numerals were still fluid, still being standardized. It raises the question, why would these inconsistencies exist if the number forms were already fixed for centuries, as traditional history claims?
And they even have a practical explanation for how artworks could be faked or altered later on.
Yes, specifically with prints like Dürer's. Copper plates used for engraving are relatively easy to modify. You could potentially scrape away an old date or name and engrave a new one. This allows for later forgeries or maybe just updates to make older artworks fit the newly established historical narrative.
Okay, this is intricate stuff. Let's move to another really provocative area. There are claims about suppressed Russian alphabets and texts dismissed as cryptograms.
Right. So mainstream history generally tells us that Russian writing before the 17th century used Cyrillic, pretty similar to the modern version.
But Fomenko and Nosovskiy challenge this.
Completely. They assert that Russians actually used multiple scripts, some of which are totally unintelligible to us today, and that this continued well into the 17th century. They even argue that passages written in supposedly normal Cyrillic from before the 17th century are often surprisingly difficult for modern experts to interpret properly. This hints, for them, at a hidden, more complex linguistic past.
Do they have a specific example?
Their prime example is the huge church bell of Zvenigorod. It was tragically destroyed in 1941, but records and descriptions exist. It dated from the 16th or 17th century and had a long inscription. Part of it was apparently written in some kind of cryptic script. Another part used familiar Cyrillic letters, but the authors claim the letters were used with different unfamiliar meanings.
So how is it translated?
Well, they highlight how earlier historians like M.N. Speransky and V.A. Kondrashina provided translations that seemed, well, smooth. Too smooth, maybe. They argue these translations omitted or kind of glossed over strange or uncanny names, possibly names of deities that didn't fit the standard Orthodox picture.
What did Fomenko and Nosovskiy find when they tried to translate it?
Their attempt revealed names like God Vavo, maybe an older form of Sava, and God Gogro, appearing right alongside perfectly standard Orthodox Christian formulas. Which raises the question, why would these seemingly non-standard divine names be suppressed or ignored, unless they pointed to a different religious reality?
They also mention how saints were referred to.
Yes, they note that before the 17th century, it seems Russian saints, like Saint Nicola, were sometimes openly called gods. You find phrases like Russian god, sea god, everyone's god. They draw a parallel to the Bible mentioning Syrian and Assyrian gods and speculate, could the Bible actually be referring to Russian gods from this 15th, 16th century Horde empire?
It's connecting some distant dots there. What about the Tsar mentioned on the bell?
The inscription mentions a Tsar Alexei. Mainstream history just assumes this must be Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the famous Romanov ruler. But the new chronology suggests, well, maybe it was another Tsar Alexei ruling somewhere else around the same time. They mention Stepan Razin's contemporary, who supposedly reigned in Astrakhan. Official history resists this idea of multiple contemporary czars with the same name. So Fomenko and Nosovskiy conclude the whole cryptogram theory was basically invented as a tool to dismiss inconvenient texts like the Zvenigorod inscription, and maybe even to authenticate later forgeries that fit the preferred narrative. It allowed historians to create a simplified, sanitized version of the past.
And they even find the bill's destruction suspicious.
Yes. They make a point of saying its destruction in 1941 wasn't directly due to military action, and that most of the fragments vanished afterwards. They heavily imply it might have been a deliberate act to get rid of a difficult piece of evidence, a witness to the true history of the Russian Horde.
That's a serious accusation.
It is, and they connect this to the town of Zvenegorod's coat of arms. The older version, from 1781, apparently showed a copper bell and mentioned an unknown alphabet. But the later Romanov-era version, from 1883, changed it to a silver bell with no mention of any secret alphabets. For them, it's another piece of evidence for systematic historical revision, cutting ties with the great empire.
And they see echoes of this elsewhere, not just in Russia.
Yes, they claim similar things happen in Europe. They point to the Santiago de Compostela Cathedral in Spain, suggesting that restoration work might have obscured or simplified original, complex lettering. Or strange signs carved on stones in St. Lawrence Cathedral in Nuremberg, Germany, which are usually just dismissed as medieval guild symbols. They think these might be remnants of suppressed scripts.
And the Arabic connection keeps popping up, too.
Right. They even mention finding a 19th century Orthodox Christian canon, basically a book of church law or nomocanon that was written entirely in Arabic.
So wrapping this part up, they present all these scattered anomalies. Weird inscriptions, missing documents, potentially altered dates, blended religious symbols.
Exactly. And they ask, are these all just isolated coincidences? Or do they collectively point towards a hidden history? A history where languages, religions, scripts, even numbers were much more mixed up, much more fluid than our standard history books allow.
Okay, we've laid out a lot of really challenging, frankly, mind-bending claims.
Yeah.
So after hearing all this, you have to ask, how has the mainstream historical community reacted?
Unsurprisingly, the reaction has been overwhelmingly negative. The new chronology is pretty much universally rejected by mainstream historians, archaeologists, linguists, scientists. They generally label it as pseudoscience.
Is this kind of chronological revisionism totally new, though?
Not entirely. Ideas questioning conventional chronology go back quite a way. Jean Hardouin in the early 17th century claimed most ancient Greek and Roman texts were actually medieval forgeries by monks. Even Sir Isaac Newton, famous for physics, dabbled in this. He proposed his own revised chronology for ancient Greece, Egypt, and the Near East, significantly shortening the timelines.
So Fomenko is the main name associated with this specific radical version.
Yes, Anatoly Fomenko. He's a prominent mathematician, actually a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences for his math work. He got interested in these ideas in the 1970s, initially through the work of an earlier Russian theorist, Nikolai Morozov. Fomenko apparently tried publishing articles in peer-reviewed history journals in the 1980s, but couldn't convince the academic establishment. So in the 1990s, he shifted to publishing books directly for a wider audience, often with his co-author Gleb Nosovskiy.
What are the main criticisms leveled against their methods?
A major criticism is about their statistical methods. Critics accuse Fomenko of essentially cherry-picking data. He finds historical parallels that seem to support his compressed timeline, but ignores vast amounts of data that contradict it. Statisticians say this violates basic rules. You can create artificial correlations if you selectively choose your matches.
Can you give an example?
Well, in analyzing a medieval text called the Tartar Relation, which describes the Mongol Empire, Fomenko uses it to argue the Mongol capital, Karakorum, was actually in central Russia near Yaroslavl. But the same text contains geographic details and travel times that clearly place Karakorum in Mongolia, where mainstream history locates it. Fomenko tends to dismiss these conflicting parts as just later editorial insertions or errors that crept into the text.
So selective use of source material.
That's the accusation. Critics say he accepts what fits his theory and rejects what doesn't, even within the same document.
How harsh has the condemnation been?
Pretty strong. Some Russian critics have called the whole project an embarrassment. Some Western critics see it as potentially fueling a kind of renewed Russian imperial ideology by rewriting history to place Russia at the center of a vast lost empire. It even won an anti-prize at the Moscow International Book Fair in a category basically called esteemed nonsense.
Ouch. What about specialists in related fields?
They've weighed in too. Renowned archaeologists and linguists have dismissed his methods, sometimes comparing them to sleight-of-hand trickery. One common argument is that using Fomenko's method of finding patterns and parallels, you could prove almost any absurd historical connection, like linking Egyptian pharaohs directly to French kings just based on reigns or selected events.
And astronomers, since some of his early arguments involved astronomical dating.
Yes, a professor emeritus of astronomy reviewed Fomenko's analysis of astronomical data used for dating eclipses and horoscopes and concluded it was absolutely worthless from a scientific standpoint.
Yet Fomenko and Nosovskiy persist. How do they respond to all this criticism?
Their main counter-argument is that the critics haven't actually proven them wrong on the core technical points. They maintain that mainstream historians haven't produced a single detailed refutation demonstrating specific errors in their mathematical, statistical, astronomical, or logical arguments. They often dismiss the critics by saying essentially, well, they're historians, they aren't mathematicians or statisticians, so they don't really understand our methods.
So it's kind of a standoff, methodologically speaking.
Very much so. A clash of disciplines and fundamental assumptions about how history works and how evidence should be interpreted.
Well, we've certainly taken a deep dive today into the new chronology. We've explored these really radical claims that history is much younger, maybe, than we believe, that vastly different cultures were perhaps far more interconnected than we usually accept, and that even something as basic as our number system might have these surprising hidden Slavic origins.
Yeah, from those Russian helmets with Arabic text to potentially missing ancient documents, redated famous artworks, swapped numbers. It's definitely a theory that presents a truly fundamental rethinking of global history.
It forces you to question the foundations.
Absolutely. And whether you find their arguments, compelling or completely unconvincing, exploring them really highlights the ongoing debates in historical research. It shows how the same artifacts, the same texts, can lead to wildly different interpretations. And it definitely pushes us to think about how much of what we accept as historical fact is itself a kind of constructed narrative, and maybe how important critical thinking is, especially now with so much information coming at us.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Well, maybe next time you encounter a historical artifact or read about an ancient battle or look at an old painting, perhaps you'll find yourself pausing for a second asking, what other stories, what other narratives might be hidden just beneath the surface here, waiting to be deciphered from their own kind of cryptograms?